I'll speak briefly about the historiography of the crisis, and I'll truncate it deliberately. And then, of course, the contemporary context and defining the Zimbabwean challenges, imagining transformation in Zimbabwe, enablers and disablers, and so on and so forth. Robert Mugabe in 1980 gave an interesting speech. And let me recite that speech because it frames part of what I will say today. He said, "Only a government that subjects itself to the rule of law has any moral right to demand of its citizens obedience to the rule of law." We felt the moment demanded of us a spirit of magnanimity rather than of arrogance, a spirit of national unity rather than division, a spirit of reconciliation rather than vindictiveness and retribution. We felt that the past and its wounds and grievances had to be buried and forgotten, but that the past and lessons it had taught us all about the evils of racial oppression, undemocratic rule, and economic exploitation had always to be remembered. To us, the time had come for those who had fought each other as enemies to accept each other now as allies, who in spite of their ideological, racial, ethnic, or religious differences were now being called upon to express one loyalty to Zimbabwe and embrace nationhood. I'm quite sure there are very few people who would disagree. If you ask me what needs to be done in Zimbabwe today, I would basically point to those few lines. And we would spend the rest of the next few days asking, how do we exit from a mode of economic exploitation, of segregation, of disunity, divisionism? How do we exit from a place where our people don't benefit from the resources, the abundant resources that Zimbabwe has? How do we even get to a stage where any government that gets to rule, to govern this country, does so according to the rule of law and derives its moral right to so do from its responsiveness to the citizens? This is somebody else that you may remember, Julius Malemi Nyerere. He says, when people find that things are going wrong, they expect to receive explanations and corrections where possible. When remedial actions are not forthcoming, people lose faith in the integrity of government. Gradually, that government loses that support and consent. So, you know, this I think we all know because this is where we are. But this is Nkrumah. Nkrumah says, there is no force, however formulated, that a united people cannot overcome. The true nature of the struggle taking place in Africa and the world is between the forces of progress and those of reaction. In the final analysis, the fight of the common man against injustice and privilege. I do not know of any greater satisfaction than honest and efficient service rendered to the people in the best interest of the people. And of course, we have our brother Walter Rodney then defined development as encompassing, amongst others, development in human society is a many-sided process. At the level of the individual, it implies increased skills and capacity, greater freedom and creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. The achievement of any of these aspects of personal development is very much tied in with the state of society as a whole. The relations which develop within any given social group are crucial to an understanding of the society as a whole. Freedom and responsibility skill have real meaning only in terms of relations of human beings and society. At the level of social groups, therefore, development implies an increase in capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. And it is useful in thinking about this that we ask ourselves certain tendencies that has happened. So I want to start with ourselves. I think, my friends, that we need to introspect. And when we introspect, here is what I personally think, as Brian Kagoro, has happened within this so-called pro-democracy platform or progressive platform. We have abdicated honest research and evidence-based policy and decision-making. And there's a tragic comedy that I witnessed, which is unrefined populism by intellectuals and CSOs and political parties. I simply call this intellectual suicide. Every thinker, every intellectual is trying to appear and sound simple, organic. And sometimes it is so perverse because their lifestyles and what they say on pulpits and platforms and their bank accounts and how they deal with the resources of the NGOs they run and how they deal with the employees in their NGOs has nothing to do with us crude. The second thing is this gap of ideas, the positive of ideas. I want to thank my brother Ibo, and thank you Tendai and others who have started gathering again people to reflect and to think, to critique, to agree, to disagree. Because at a certain stage in this space, we became anti-intellectual. If Takura Jangaja started abstracting, would say, no, we don't want theories. We don't want these bookish things. And then what would happen is sometimes we would have someone come from the UK or the US with one of the cheapest, unrefined, untested theories, and everybody thinks it's a new theory. Political economy, Ibo Mandaza was doing political economy analysis before we even started our human rights movement in this country. But for some reason, the biggest thing happening over the last 7 years was teaching NGOs how to do political economy analysis. Because when it was organically grown, we rejected it. So there is a tragedy amongst ourselves. In searching for an organic linkage to the broad mass, we committed this intellectual suicide. And you were not made intelligent purely for the purposes of becoming elites. You were made intelligent for the purposes of fashioning solutions to the collective of our common challenges. The third thing that I saw was the tendency towards insults. I think part of our political culture, whether you are reading Jonathan and Mtrangwa or the comedy that went on in the MDC, what I yearn for, and I'll tell you what I miss the days when you could have a difference between Edson Drobo and Walter Kamba and so on and so on. And there was a finesse to it. There was a wit to it. This crude insult about your mother, your private parts, and so on and so is feeding into a social psyche of a violent society that argues violently. A violent society that thinks that difference in views simply means it must be quashed, it must be killed. The greatest achievement of dictatorship in this country was to turn all of us into this one singular choir. That if your idea is not the same as mine, then you must be abused, you must be insulted. So I'm not talking about the hard things yet. I'm talking about us as a platform, because there is no way you can have many national dialogues trying to build national consensus and platform. If the modus of engagement is insults and vilification, unity will not come out of that. We built the NCA because we were willing to ignore the fact that when I was kicked out of university, it was Welshman Movie. I had to sit with him in the NCA, and we form a common platform. There were many things we were willing to forgive, to forget, not to pay particular attention to, because those things were not important to the broader struggle. And this moment of the country is in order to have a forward trajectory, there are certain things we need to answer amongst ourselves. We spent the last 10 years viciously harming and wounding each other, from Zinasu to NCA, to crisis to MDC. We have become experts at self-inflicted pain. If we're going to rebuild, one of the solutions, my friends, is how to go beyond the hurt. And what's even tragic for you, my sisters, is that some of the fights have nothing to do with ideology and politics. They are based on fights that we had over girlfriends and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we have another problem, the infallible head syndrome. Basically, what has happened is that when Kagoro becomes head of crisis, or when so-and-so becomes head of an institution or a party, they are beyond criticism. Bands of youth are employed to beat up anyone who differs. So we now employ violence in order to manufacture consensus and consent. It is the same instrument and approach that the establishment has used for years. Clearly, a position of leadership in a democratic movement and process does not entitle you to immunity to criticism and critique. And let's start there. Zamchia can be critiqued and criticized. Kagoro can be critiqued. Mandaza can be critiqued and criticized. And it is what characterizes a democratic space. The next one is the big manism or womanism. I couldn't find an English term for it. But often I can't tell the difference between the executive ministers in ZANU and the heads of institutions in civil society. They all drive four-wheel drives. They all live in Borodale. They all shop very expensive. Even me, who was a UN bureaucrat, I cannot afford some of the... Even Ibo, who was working for many years before I went to primary school, he can't afford some of the lifestyles that these guys live. And the thing is, this primitive accumulation, using the social justice space for primitive accumulation, defines the rot in civil society. You can't supplant a system that you have become a poor mimic of. And of course, some of it is downright kleptocracy. There are some people, of course, we know who just helped themselves a little bit to donor money and so on and so forth. Okay, the next one was victimology. You know, let me start off by saying, I was kicked out of university. I was brought back by a high court order by Chichigao Siku. I used to run Radio VIP. It was bombed. So what? I have people in this room who were arrested, who were detained, who were, if we go back to the war, we have built this narrative where we exclude people on the basis of what they've not experienced. It is a shame. We no longer include people on the basis of the ideas that they bring to the platform. So for a movement that is depleted and that needs to bring all the people it can, we have mastered categories of exclusion. Were you there when we started NCA? Were you there when we started Crisis? Were you there when we were arrested and beaten up before the big march? Look, I'm sorry you were beaten up. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were starting NCA. But I am a citizen and I want to contribute. I'm beginning to say that for those of you who've suffered, may one day we will build a plaque for you in First Street because you are heroes of the revolution. But for now, please allow those who have not yet suffered to join the community of ideation to fashion a new process and project that will redeem our nation. Because a nation that is made up of people who have suffered immensely, who can describe their suffering and exclude everyone else on the basis of how much suffering, there is no genius in suffering, Samu. I want to suggest next that we have this tenacity for office in civil society. You know, everybody doesn't want third term. They keep describing how Mugabe has been here for 35 years and so on and so forth. And I know that civil society are private spaces, but I was part of founding at least 10 or 15 of some of the leading groups here. We agreed terms of office. We agreed. Some of us served and left. You know, I'm still surprised. People are amending German constitution. If you amend a small organization constitution, which has less than a million, what will happen when we give you state power? I don't know if I'm making sense. Okay. So what I am essentially saying is the lens that you wear will determine how you view our crisis. You view it either as a governance and impunity crisis, a national cohesion and historical trauma crisis, or an economic structural transformation crisis. And I think it's all of the above. And when you privilege your analysis, you will realize why it's all of the above. The struggle that we started for democratization, which described the Zimbabwean crisis, was based on this: the right to be a Zimbabwean, the right to belong or to become a full citizen with full rights, the right to belong, right? This is in common with others. We started off in the ruling party, strike fear at the heart of the white man, our real enemy. Those people without totems, the bond freeze. So the exclusion matrix grew. And hopefully we can conquer this. Then the pillars of structural transformation, because the transformation we're talking about, and I like to emphasize this, change may happen and it is purely replacement and not transformation. It is possible to have someone who's not in ZANU replace Robert and still have every principle, every approach to governance, and every inclination to loot from the state. So we need to define that contours of what will constitute transformation for us. And for me, the constitutionalism, rule of law, and access to justice, we have done enough talking about. We even have frameworks. But the progressive public financial management, public financing systems, I don't think we have acquainted ourselves sufficiently with. Whether it's progressive taxation, whether it's we have not, as civil society, waded into the economics field to understand. And you economists, you have kept this thing so hidden, the same way the lawyers did before the NCA, and made the constitution appear like a lawyer's document, when in essence, it's a popular expression of the will of the people. Economics is the lived reality of the people. Please demystify it, let's simplify it, and make it the theater of struggle as we go forward. Because it is economics that determines whether I'm able to pay fees Economics that determines whether I'm able to travel. Economics determines whether I'm able to feed myself. That determines whether I'm able to plow, to farm. I'm able to educate my children. So it is useful to make this the new center of popular struggle and to do so in a nuanced way. The second is the social policy agenda. I think that we've had, and thank you for those of you who talk about social protection, it's a very good thing, but it's insufficient for Zimbabwe. Until we conceptualize the linkage of social policy to economic policy and other policies, we are wading in the dark. So we need a much radical nuance that begins to ask, what is the social policy that, and of course, Zimbabwe's biggest problem at the moment is inequality and inequity. Some of it historical, but some of it very current. The gap between the majority and the minority has grown by over 900% in just the last 4 years, or since the inclusive government. Can I explain what I mean? The majority of the population in this country is women and young people. The level of income or non-income for women and young people in this country has diminished by a quotient of about 900% in comparison to the elite that's running this country, even in the midst of crisis, even when on paper they earn only $500, even when they are members of the opposition who were part of the inclusive government. Some went in, got 3 vehicles all at the same time, Mercedes-Benz, Land Rover, and so on and so forth. The next thing is that raising agricultural productivity. I think that the issue is not telling people that agriculture will solve our problems. I don't think it will. Dependence on rain-fed agriculture is not our solution. But agriculture is so critical to dealing with our levels of unemployment and re-stimulation in the economy. So by agricultural productivity, I'm talking about agro-based industries as well as agriculture. But how do we do it based in the reality we're in now? The majority of the farms are in the hands of some political class, and of course there are few entrepreneurs who own farms. The rest of you who are talking about agriculture and even writing nicely about it, you don't own a plot or even something to. So somehow no, it is true. It is true. I've been asking myself that you can describe capitalism, describe it glibly and its benefits, and do so like a spectator at a soccer match. You will never play. So the question this House must be asking is, are there possibility of making the generality of the citizenry that was not privileged to access land to become a player, since we say agriculture is important as one of the key levers to our industrialization. The second one is construction. It is not possible for government to be awarding contracts to Chinese and still say it wants to create employment. Because one of the things you need to protect is who builds your roads. You can have a Chinese firm do it, but the labor must be derived from your own people. Because that's how you get household incomes to be increased, household savings, household purchasing power. If we are not using our public sector works as a cushion, as a conduit for creating employment, I don't see how else. The service sector, when we removed the protections in the service sector and handed it over to hounds, one of the things that we have done is we have foreclosed any possibility for the youth of this country to be employed, except in political parties to beat up opponents. So in realistic terms, we need to say to ourselves, where will employment in dealing with transformation be created and how? And that how I have not quite heard it from the opposition. I hear nice policies, but the truth of the matter is when we had an opportunity to build that road and the opposition was part of that contracting, nobody talked about major contract with subcontracts to SMEs. Nobody. Even the doyens of indigenization did not figure out that legally you could structure an award of a contract to a big player and require that there be sub-awards to at least 50 to 100 SMEs. There is no indigenization mindset in our indigenization talk. Okay. Of course, STEM, Jonathan Moy and others are onto it. We can analyze it. I think that we have people who are better qualified. And then, of course, the state, this developmental state. In my view, comrades, I need not talk about this because I think that Pilani and others will talk about the developmental state and so on and so forth. And we have people who are very qualified to talk about development governance and so on and so forth. I have said in many words the following things. right? And what we need, if you look at the small bullet points after bullet point 3, what do we need to do? Right? A clear set of guiding values and ideas that capture national imagination. Regalvanizing the nation is not simply the collective sense that there is injustice. That collective sense has never been a mobilizing force in and of itself. There needs to be an objective that is achievable, and I dare say that now mobilizing people around an election is now inadequate. I want to suggest to you. Number 2, a decisive, skilled, broad-based, and united leadership that galvanizes the social base. Our leadership has become narrow. If it is not 59 lawyers and 3 economists and 5 political scientists, we somehow have moved away from where we started as the NCA, because we realized that leadership needed various technical competencies to be all called leaders. There were some who could speak at a rally. There were some who could write papers. There were some who could research and bring knowledge. Our singular definition of leadership as a rally is what has killed the quality of leadership, even in civil society and the alternative movement. So this intellectual leadership and leadership of ideas is key, in my view, going forward. The next one, an active citizenship. I think citizenry, in my view, my friends, yes, we have a crisis of leadership and so on and so forth. The biggest crisis is a crisis of citizenship. I was a recent graduate from university when Tawanda Mtasa, myself, Depros Mchena, and others started putting together NCA. We had no experience, we had no donor, we had no funds. Many of the initiatives, Kudachitsike will tell you, that were started, there was no money in crisis. There was a floppy disk that she had in her office. The difference is this. We auctioned our souls to the political parties under an analysis that was only partially correct. That said, ultimately it is about conquest and retention of state power, and that's only done through the vehicle of a political party. And because of that, we dissolved everything that we were doing in the arena of social struggle, or at least de-emphasized it, and mortgaged it to political party brinksmanship. And as a result, we're hemorrhaging. You know why we're hemorrhaging? The leadership in civil society became those people that could easily graduate into the political party. They could buy voters to come to their leadership, so on and so forth. Okay, I was getting to the juicy part. But the point I wanted to make is, let's redefine leadership for this space. The third is the governance coordination mechanisms. I don't think that we have Nango, then we had crisis, and so on and so forth. Look, the days when we could afford to have Nango, crisis, and X competing are over. If you want to do the fight in the current moment, when you have a resurgent ruling party which now has a majority, real or contrived, and an opposition almost in near comatose, what you need is a civil society that has an effective coordination platform and mechanism. And this means a lot of egos have to be sacrificed. I mean, that essentially means we need all of us to say, okay, we may not like X, but X is going to lead us. Because she technically is a more uniting figure. I'm tired of us electing polarizing figures to lead civil society. The day they are elected, because they can buy votes, you know that everybody else is going to leave. So the issue is decide. Are you going to have a minimum program and minimum platform of action or not? Let me try and wind up, and Grace, I'll ask you for a few moments. So this I already dealt with, but the key moments I was going to ask you for are just that context I have not ignored. That repression has played a very big role. I've also not ignored the historical bit about Rhodesia and what Rhodesia legacy is. I've not ignored the Zimbabwean reality. I think I described it. I want to get to a few solutions that I had. You can see I had prepared this because I was told I had an hour to speak about it, but you can see the natural resource, the rights abuses, for those who are human rights entrepreneurs and may be worried that I didn't put human rights in the description of the crisis. And the lens that we use to see the crisis. Basically, for here I was suggesting that we have different lens in which we look at the crisis, right? And unfortunately, what we need to do is to see that we don't become model mercenaries or model missionaries. Because there are things that Robert Mugabe says that are partially correct. And it is useful that in making the point, you don't deny an argument that will be useful for your own recovery when you are the one in power. The national challenges, I think I described them. There are many. I try to talk about the division in our society, the resurgence, ethnicism, regionalism, and so on and so forth, disease, and so on and so forth. So this is what I wanted to say. In characterizing this, we normally talk about root causes. And I want to suggest to you that perhaps it's an inappropriate term, right? Because root suggests that it is the tree part that seeds into the soil that is a problem. I'm suggesting to you, if you read quickly, that yes, there may be soil causes. The issues that are broadly contextual because we've not talked about the structure in a meaningful sense. There may be neighborhood-related issues because development in South Africa, in Mozambique, and amongst the other liberation parties, we are not immune to how liberation parties react to what happens to the other liberation parties in the region, and so on and so forth. Root causes, I took a bit from what raw data had said, the stem causes, racialization, inconvenient truth, and so on and so forth. So the point I was making is that, we needed to go beyond. Don't worry about this global insecurity and so on and so forth. This is if you summarize everything that are called the challenges, Madam Chair, these are they. We needed to go, right? If you say the dilemmas, these are the dilemmas, right? If you say what is the political parties, succession and bloodletting, and so on and so forth. I'm going to take 2 minutes left of the 5 minutes that I said I'll take, just to describe this problem. In order to deal with the problem in Mozambique first and then in Congo second, the ruling elite brought soldiers into the economy using various devices and methods. And the soldiers became critical players within the economy. As civil society, we concentrated on the soldiers in civic institutions or public institutions, as an electoral commission and so on and so forth, because we were purely focused on the impact of the soldiers on what we thought was an electorally based transition. We did not pay attention to the soldiers in the economy, the companies that the soldiers were establishing, and so on and so forth. But it is now important that research pays attention to this, because these companies and entities have become an important vehicle for building loyalty amongst the security sectors, but also for driving particular sectarian agenda amongst the security sector. And then soldiers implicated in corruption, unpaid, underpaid public servants, and so on and so forth. The situation with civil servants or public servants who are not paid is not just a joke to be described. It is also an opportunity for this force, for this space, to deal with, not only in describing that they are not paid, but for understanding from the disgruntled civil servants what goes on beyond the Iron Curtain. Then the apartheid system within the state security sector. Basically, what has happened in the state security sector is that there are those who are seen as aligned to the gravy train, and others who are part of a majority, who are not part of the eating club and sector. So the opportunity is, how does this space engage with those actors? And then civil society I talked about, and just go to the solution. I think that mission drift, I talked about all those things. This minimum platform of action. But the biggest problem right now in Zimbabwean civil society is, and I do respect those of you who've come from the donor agencies, please keep coming, keep giving money to civil society. But the truth of the matter is, the agenda will not become sufficiently radical and transformational as long as it is mortgaged, right? If you want to give us money, I know that we stole some of it before, but give that money, we will administer it, expand it, and creatively. Because at the moment, the financing mechanism around projectization does not lend itself to transformation and revolution. It is a status quo model. It will reinforce the status quo. It will produce many papers describing the status quo, but it will not lead to. So for me, beyond leadership, the biggest challenge of civil society is an independent civil society fund for Zimbabwe, not administered by PricewaterhouseCoopers or KPMG or the British government, but an independent fund administered by Zimbabweans. And that means the Zimbabweans must set up this coordination platform. The second thing is the CSO Technical and Political Capacity Building Center. I think the political economy analysis that Ibo and others are well known for doing across this continent, and my friend Mrisa and the lecturers at the back, the transmission of that knowledge and those skills to the cadre of civil society leaders, is we have no platform or mechanism. An opportunistic workshop is not the means of growing the next generation. I think that we basically need to answer that question and say, we need to constitute that center, and I'm challenging those of you in the leadership of civil society. Find the technicians among you, constitute this thing, and that's where you send your new employees, and you know that they'll get the political orientation, they'll get skills on how to manage. Because the biggest problem we have with the grand theft in civil society is they are not only poor thieves, they are also poor managers, right? Because that component of leadership has not been taught to them. Then the last thing on this was the social and political program synergy. I think that we do need. Grace, you have been very, very indulgent with me, right? The economic logic of indigenization, the equity aspects, a clear independent performance and monitoring system. In my sense, my problem is not 51% or 40%. My problem is that in 4 or 5 years, no one will know how to measure the developmental outcome of this percentage, whether it's 5% or 51%. The benchmarks are not clearly set. So anyone can say they have achieved. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, friends. I'll leave the solutions on the